Welcome to Three Devs and a Maybe. Now introducing your show hosts, Michael Budd, Fraser Hart, Lewis Caines, and Ed Mann.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Devs and a Maybe. My name's Ed Mann, and today we're joined by Phil Sturgeon. How you doing, Phil?
Hello again. Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's been a long time in the making. I think we've tried to arrange this I think all of last year. I think it was on and off, kind of trying. You were in England, and then trying to organise all this. But finally, yes, we can. Midnight for me, 7 o'clock in the evening for you. We both finished work for the day.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, man. No, it's my bad that the last one didn't go ahead in England. So, no, definitely.
What happened? I can't remember. I don't know. I think I was just getting drunk or something.
I think you pinged us and we didn't get back to you in time, and we couldn't get up to London. It's just trying to arrange everything. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was the plan. We were going to have a pint and then do the podcast, but then that's fine.
That is, life happens. No, so how's life treating you though, man? How's WeWork going?
Yeah, really well. It's a lot of fun. I'm actually kind of working at a startup that's probably not going to go bankrupt within the first 18 months. So that's quite nice. They've got a huge team. They've got 80, 90 developers or people on the digital team, at least, that I'm part of. And they're going to double it next year. So they're growing huge. It's a whole bunch of Rails and Node and React and stuff. But it's a lot of fun.
That's cool, yeah, because I think the last time we spoke to you, the last time we spoke to you, you were back in England because you couldn't get back into America. I think that was the stage.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the last time I spoke to you then must have been kind of before the last job. So while I've been in New York, I've had 3 different jobs. The first startup was about 18 months. They went bankrupt and I got kicked out of the country. Then I worked for another startup after the last recording we did. And that was a really promising, really awesome company. It was carpooling, basically. And because the United States at the moment is in a 20-year low for gas prices, people just they weren't financially incentivized, right? So then it came down to, you make a little bit of money, but you can maybe sell your car, and you can, traveling with someone else will help you save a bit of money. And they just, the financial savings wasn't enough to get over the fact there's some random person in your car. So just carpooling didn't work, and it's not going to work right now. So they went bankrupt, and then luckily at this time it wasn't so bad. I fairly quickly, I actually was swapping jobs before the bad times started, and on the last day of my notice, there was a conversation with the entire company, and they were like, "By the way, everyone's fired." And I was like, "Oh, well, that worked out fairly well. I've just
dodged that bullet."
Yeah, nice.
That's really interesting. I mean, because obviously the startup life, and everyone thinks about it and has, very different opinions on it and stuff. And for you then, what have been the pros and cons of working in the startup, and kind of things that you can take away from both the experiences that you've had?
I think it's really important to work at a lot of different types of company, right? So I've worked for massive corporations, and I'm questionably back at one now. And I've worked for tiny startups, and I've worked by myself, and for 5-person companies, and for 50-person companies, and for 100-person. And I think it's really important to switch around from different sizes like that, because it gives you a much broader understanding of how programming actually works. Because there's a lot of people that, they grow as a developer and learn new techniques and expand, and they work for bigger and bigger and bigger companies and bigger paychecks. And the person that they become at the end is very different from that scrappy, got to get things done kind of developer they were at the start. And there's this unfortunate conflation of becoming a better programmer with using more complicated practices. And that's how you get into this whole everything has to be DDD and everything has to be done this way, and everything, you get into these locked into these things. And so what I've really enjoyed is working for startups and the whole range of things is that sometimes I focus on RAD and just knocking things out, because if I spend 3 months building the most perfect system in the world, then we're going to run out of money before this even launches. But then other times you've got this version 1 product out that's a piece of junk, and you want to really focus on making that better or making it more performant. And the last 2 companies I was at, I was I was forced to learn a lot of stuff and do a lot of things myself, and had like really varying timelines. So we had that, get that version 1 out right now, and then we had like 2 or 3 months of waiting for feedback, which was make this not suck. Like, we don't have any business requirements for you right now, so like make it better.
Yep, get cleaning.
Right. So it's really nice to jump around and do different things like that. And I had a lot of time working. A lot of ability to work remote, so I just went to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and like I Airbnb'd my apartment and just worked on the beach, and it was great, and it wasn't vacation time. So like stuff like that is really cool, and you don't get to do stuff like that at larger companies a lot of the time.
No, absolutely. And that's really interesting. And I think like, that kind of the different kinds of philosophy and thinking behind them, where you go from the MVP to then, all right, now I need to start making this code maintainable because, we've had success and, people are using it. Right. Let's make it less crappy.
Yeah.
That kind of is an interesting, and obviously going into WeWork, then I'm guessing obviously there must be a heap of code that's already there now, and kind of what's your kind of role there at the moment?
So I'm just on one of the teams. I'm currently a full stack developer, which is interesting because going in, I told them like I know the job title says full stack developer, but I'm looking to do like back end heavy, right? I've been doing nothing but APIs and services for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and I used to use jQuery a bit, but like my focus has always been back end really, and so they were like, oh, yeah, that's absolutely fine. That's totally fine. Don't worry about it. And then all of a sudden it was, right, you need to learn React now. And I was like, oh, no.
That's not what I said.
That's the opposite of backend. So it's interesting. And I'm learning a lot of stuff. And it's been 6 months almost exactly. And I'm not good at front end, but I know how it works. So I can like move things around. And I've learned all about the benefits of Webpack versus Gulp. Stuff I'd rather not have to know about, but I do know about it now. So
this is the thing is, it's the whole sum of its parts thing. And like, obviously, if you jump into that and you have to deal with it, then it's good to kind of go in thinking, right, I'm going to learn this stuff and I'm going to understand it and embrace it.
For sure. And if your API team don't really know how the front ends work for different systems, then you kind of get screwed. One of the things I liked about working at the last company, Ride, was that because it was a small company, and we quite often it was a lot of remote working, a lot of pairing, but a lot of the time they'd like drag us all from over the world to go and sit next to each other and hack on stuff. And I got to learn how a lot more of iOS works and how a lot of like Ember.js works. And by learning kind of the conventions and the ways that popular tools handle API interactions and like the REST clients and the data layers for those systems helped me design an API that could like fit their needs better. Because although theoretically we'd like it if our APIs were completely agnostic of client stuff, it's not always the case. And like if you do this one thing, it won't work on Ember data. If you do this other thing, it won't work for REST kit or whatever. So that was interesting to do.
Yeah, that's it. It's the theory to then actually putting it into practice and realizing, no, it doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah.
And like, because it's interesting you said there, so you did a lot of like remote working and stuff. Like, how did you find that? Because I suppose working on your own and stuff like that and all the different kinds of jobs you've had in the past, like you must have done that and you've worked in the office and stuff. And what do you kind of prefer? What's your kind of take on that?
It's an interesting one because everything sucks and everything's great. There's a lot of pros and cons to everything, and I think again people kind of try some of these things once and decide that they're bad, and they don't really jump between them that much. But I really hate working from my house. Because home office is really kind of boring, and if you've seen that oatmeal where it's just like after 3 months, guys like, oh, where have you been? How you doing? He's like, I'm home, derper, and he just can't use words anymore. So I actually found myself working in co-working spaces quite often when I was working for myself, and sometimes I'd work from my house. Sometimes I did this one crazy backpack trip where I just spent 3 months taking a Greyhound like a bus all the way around the States, and just went to like every state through the South, up the West, everywhere. And that was really fun because I just worked from random hostels. I'd work from, mountains, like really ridiculous stuff.
It's pretty amazing.
Unfortunately, I was doing it on a $200 netbook because I lost my MacBook in New York on the first night. Things get stolen from hostels, so watch out for that. I built like this entire MongoDB driven like social network on a $200 netbook I bought from Kmart. And it was so shit that it would run out of memory after 30 minutes, meaning I was basically forced to do Pomodoros because I had to restart the laptop. So yeah, it's like silly things like that. And it's fun. Like in my perfect world, I would have an office that I can go to where I know that like a fair number of my coworkers are going to be, and I can go there for a couple of days out of the week and maybe work from home for another one, and then like maybe take a week or two to go and work from somewhere completely random. I don't know, like having the whole you have 2 weeks of holiday and that's all you're allowed to have is alien to me. Like I've not had that in a really long time. And now it's terrifying. And like people are asking me to speak at conferences. I'm like, nope, can't. I've already used half my vacation time this year and I don't want to do it.
Yeah, because I noticed when you said on PHP Town Hall that, you know, that you'd like already booked in all this stuff by the time you'd actually started WeWork.
Yeah, that was really bad. I was there. I joined the company in July. And I was like, oh, yeah, so my sister's getting married in September. I have to go to Bulgaria in September. And I'm also going somewhere else in December. Bye. And I was like,
thanks for hiring me. Bye.
Yeah, I'll see you next year. So that's pretty tricky. Like the last company, it was really cool. They had a conference policy, and if you was, as long as your work was getting done, they would not only allow you to take as much time off as you wanted for conferences, but they would, even if you were speaking, then they would pay for your flights or hotel as long as you could get the other one covered by the conference.
Wow, that's pretty sweet.
And yeah, so I got to speak at like 10 or 11 conferences in 1 year. And I'd like take my laptop and I'd work while I wasn't speaking. And then I'd have a day or two to go and like explore the place I was in. And then I'd come home, and that was really cool. And all the work got done. Like you're never just going to sit there and be like, fuck my team, I'm in Brazil. You know, you always want to help your team get the job done. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be working at the company. So I do miss that policy. But larger companies like WeWork can't just have their people vanishing off all the time. I totally get it, but it's sad.
Hopefully you try and employ it in, you know. So for the audience, definitely check out the latest PHP Town Hall podcast. Sadly, Phil is no longer a part of, but you are moving on to like API busters and kind of moving on from the PHP world.
Yeah. I don't know if it's sadly for PHP Town Hall. I think it's going to be much better now that I'm gone. If anyone that doesn't know, it's being taken over by Amanda Folson, and the previous co-host Ben's sticking around. So those two people are going to do a great job. I'm working on... After I did the book, you know, I did the Build APIs You Won't Hate book, and I put everything that I knew at the time about APIs, about kind of the theory more than the specific, you know, here's how you make it in PHP or whatever. A lot of theory in there. And since then, a lot of stuff's changed. I wrote that book based on my experiences for the first of the 3 companies out here in New York. And then while I was at the last company, I actually kind of learned a lot more, and things were quite different. A lot of this change came from doing it in Rails. It was a Rails company with Rails testing tools, and there were whole different practices and the kind of the gems that are around, and the fact the company liked JSON API when I used to hate it, and the fact that JSON API changed a lot when they finally got to version 1. All those things basically mean that whilst the theory hasn't changed that much, like if I was to do a book about building APIs again, then I'd probably want to focus a lot more on here's how you actually physically build one from start to end, instead of just the theory. Although I guess I'd probably want to have both books. I'd want to have the theory book, and now I want to start doing like here's how you actually build one with concrete stuff. And I was toying with the idea of doing that as a book, but I think it would be really code heavy. Like I'd have to just have massive, like 5 pages of code and stuff like that. Terrible. So what I'm going to try doing is I'm going to do it as a video series. I've already done a few like livecoding.tv kind of training practice sessions while I get the thoughts together. So if you go watch those videos, they're like 5 times longer than they should be while I'm Googling how the fuck to do something that I should.
No, I think they're great, man. I really like them.
I'm like, how did I do this? I did this 2 years ago. I totally forgot. So that's very kind. But I'm doing those, and then I'm going to basically turn that into a proper video series and do like a $9 a month subscription, have loads of different things, and be here's how to build a REST API in Rails, and here's how to build a GraphQL API in Rails, here's how to build a RPC API in Go, and stuff like that. Like just show people how it's done in lots of different languages with lots of different architectures, and makes useful stuff that people can learn from.
No, absolutely, and to say the book, highlight the book, actually how great it is. Like honestly, I really appreciate the work you did in the book. And it's interesting you say like, because it's obviously targeted at people in PHP, but interestingly, like obviously, I mean, it's agnostic with the theory and things like that. Like, have you found a lot of your Ruby friends kind of, and other language, people who study other languages and use other languages, enjoy it?
I've been doing things like I do bundle books with other people. Basically, I'm just like a complete marketing shill these days. So, like, I see a book come out and it goes up on the Lean Pub bestseller page, and it says like, like Node.js craftsman, learn how to build amazing stuff in with Node.js. And I'm like, hey buddy, do you want to partner up? And then it can be like build amazing APIs with Node.js. Read how to do Node stuff here, and then read how to do API stuff here, and then ta-da. So I've been doing a lot of that. And that seems to have helped. Like, sales haven't really diminished since I launched it 2 years ago, which is crazy. Like, I really thought it would be nothing by now. I thought it would do like 100 sales and get me some beer money. So I'm happy that it's still doing all right. And part of that is because I keep it up. Like, if I wasn't doing API blog posts and linking to it, and if I wasn't doing these bundles and linking to those, then it probably would have trailed off. But because I'm partnering up with these people, and they're kind of tweeting about it, and they're following is doing it, and like, I had the official Vue.js account tweet a link to the bundle because they saw that was mentioned with a Vue book. So stuff like that really helps, and it means that people from a lot of different groups and programming languages are actually reading it. And there's been a few dicks. Like, there's on the refunds, there's like 3% of people that have bought the book, or 2.8% of people have asked for a refund. And I think the main thing is like, oh, I don't care about PHP, or like. Or it doesn't show you exactly how to implement it in how to implement an OAuth 2 server in Ruby. And I'm like, right, but implementing an OAuth 2 server in Ruby is not only kind of tricky, but you use a gem to do that, and you just install the gem. And if you want to see how the gem works, go to the README of the gem page, because that gem is going to change over time, and so just go there. And like, if I do it for Ruby, I've got to do it for Java, and I've got to do it for Python, and I've got to do it for JavaScript. I got to do all this stuff. So like, I tried to just say, here's a concrete example in PHP because I have to do something. And here are links to, resources or tutorials or gems or whatever that can show you how to do it in other languages. And when it comes down to like just if there's a code, something like an example of a HTTP client, like, here's how you make a web request. Here's how you make a HTTP web request to do X. I'll show how to do it with Guzzle, and I'll show how to do it with HTTP Party or whatever in different languages. And so people liked that, but that's not enough for some people. But nothing's ever enough for everyone.
And I think it's a bit naive to kind of just assume that you have to show it for a particular audience. Like, a book can be, maybe it's like the Gang of Four book, Design Patterns. Like, that was written for C++ and Smalltalk, like the examples were. But like, that has, standed the test of time in many languages. And like, in any of these kind of things, like books that, kind of more about the theory, the language is really just a tool used to describe some of the implementation-ish details, or more maybe the flow of things.
Yeah, I mean, you can look and see how the book, how it works in the book, and to kind of get the concepts and the understanding, and then you can go and look at the changelog to see what's different, or you can look at the documentation and be like, oh, okay, that thing is like a slightly different thing now. But it is annoying, but if that's the biggest complaint people have, that like, the book is out of date, it's that's fine, because the book in general isn't out of date. Like, the book is accurate to when it was released, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think people should run into libraries and just set fire to anything that's a couple of years old. It doesn't make any sense. So the fact that it's on Laravel 4.2 instead of Laravel 5. Whatever the hell they've released now, like, I don't really care about that, because it shows how it works and it runs. Like, you can still go into the code samples that I've put online and run Composer install and Artisan serve, and it will still work. So that's the main thing. And if stuff's changed since then you get it. It's fine. But the API video series, I'll eventually do one in PHP as well, right? Like, I'm gonna have the same kind of series with the same endpoints and the same fields and the same tests, and just implement one of them in PHP. So I can just put an update thing in there that just says like, oh, and if you want new stuff, here's a video series by Phil. Give me another $9. Whatever.
Oh, so actually that brings up, like, obviously PHP, I don't think you're using it day to day anymore. You've slowly kind of moved away from the PHP community. And I'm just wondering, like, kind of what the feeling behind that was. Like, was it intentional to kind of move into another community like Ruby, or was it just kind of, it just happened?
It just happened. It was kind of funny. I'd never really like thought too much about it, right? Like, I know that using just PHP for everything is pretty much always the wrong idea. Like, you should try and learn as many languages as you can. But I was always, for a long time, I was kind of trapped in the PHP community, because like, I was known as the Code Igniter developer or the Fuel PHP guy or whatever. And the more the more well-known I became with any of those tools, the more I would get work using those tools.
So it was just kind of, it's a snowball effect, isn't it?
It was like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it was like, I was really glad that the kind of that doing the API stuff kind of actually broke me out of there, because for a while I was just the CodeIgniter guy, and then I tried to become the language agnostic, the framework agnostic guy, right, helping with the Fig, and that kind of broadened my appeal to the rest of the PHP community. So I got good jobs and good contracts and good things out of that, and I'm glad that I managed to broaden myself to like being an API guy, because that broadened out of just PHP and into other languages as well. So when the one company fell apart and I was kind of scrambling looking for a plan, a friend of mine was like, oh yeah, I've been reading your blog for ages and I like your stuff. Do you want to come over here and work for us? I mean, we're Ruby, but whatever, it's all the same. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So it just happened that way. And I was pretty useless for the first month or two, but I worked with amazing people. And we actually had some like core contributors to Rails and core contributors to Rails API, which is a gem that got rolled in recently to make Rails a bit more API-ish. And so because I was working with really great people, and they were very patient, and they had like an education budget, like $2,000 a year, where you could just go and you could go to conferences, you could go to buy screencasts, you could buy all sorts of stuff like that. And that really helped. So I got up to speed on Rails pretty quick, and I'd done Rails in the past. Like I back in 2010, I think I made a few projects with it and used it for about a year. So it wasn't totally alien. But what I found really nice was that, because when you're building an API in Rails, it's actually really, really similar to doing it in Laravel. Laravel 4 at least. I don't know anything about how Laravel 5 works, but it's basically like you're just turning a web request into JSON, right? And there's some stuff in the middle. There's a bit of business. There's a bit of domain logic. You want to serialize that output. And all these things are really similar. Like if you're using Active Record, it's really similar to Eloquent. The routing systems for both are fairly similar. If you're serializing stuff, I built a thing called Fractal for the PHP League, which is incredibly similar to Active Model Serializer for Rails. So it's the same steps you go through, like the same concepts, and it's just slightly different syntax. And most of that syntax is like, don't put a semicolon on it. So it was really easy to kind of to switch over, and it was never intentional, but I was really happy with the result. I feel like part of the reason I got so involved with the PHP community was I saw a lot of gaps that needed filling. There are a lot of, problems. There's a lot of people shouting at each other, so I tried to set things straight. There's a lot of people not knowing where good information was, so I really put a lot of effort into helping with PHP the right way. There were packages that I felt should definitely have existed that just didn't exist. So I helped to create them and find ones that weren't very well known about and kind of help make them better with those authors. And that was the PHP League. So there was a lot of kind of things that I thought I could do to help improve the PHP community. But when I got to the Ruby community, I was like, oh, they've got this covered. It's fine. I can just cycle. It's totally okay.
Yeah, that's it. You can just have a life as well.
I was like, what the hell? I don't have to do any of this shit anymore. And like all the stuff I was doing just gets you shouted at anyway. So the fact that I could just go to a community where like they've been doing gems for a lot longer than we've been doing packages. So they've got a lot more stuff out there. And the stuff that we have got, like their stuff is kind of better. I'm saying we and they in a kind of a weird way, but you know what I mean? That was what I was thinking at the time. And like not to shit on PHP at all. Like I'm very honest and frank about like where PHP is better than Ruby. I've done a few articles about that sort of stuff, and like we do have some great stuff. Like I don't crap on PHP. I just think that Ruby has done a lot of stuff better. They definitely have their problems, I'm sure, and there are weird things their language does, and Rails can be a bit of a mess sometimes, and DHH is a character, but they're just a lot further ahead in a lot of aspects, especially when it comes to API development. So for me, it was a really happy change once I got past kind of the weird transition state at the start.
Actually, kind of going back a little bit, why did you get into API development then? What drew you? Was that again like kind of it just happened that you started doing more APIs, or was there like an intentional, I want to look into APIs and kind of study them more?
Yeah, I just found out that I was doing a lot of API work. I released something called CodeIgniter REST server back in 2009 or something. And it was a piece of crap. Like, I'm embarrassed about it. It was buggy. There wasn't a single test. It was powering like the UN and part of Bloomberg and part of Apple. And like everyone used this piece of crap code that had no tests whatsoever. And it was nothing to do with REST. All it was like a HTTP, a router replacement or extension for CodeIgniter that supported HTTP verbs and content negotiation. So if you were to look at the Richardson maturity model, it was basically, I think, like level 1 or something. It was not REST. There was nothing to do with hypermedia. It didn't really help with any of that. But it did help with some stuff. And I released that, and I did a talk about, I think my first ever talk that wasn't at a conference I knocked together was about that. It was about using REST, and it was like REST and CodeIgniter, or REST and Expression Engine or something. I think I gave it at the Expression Engine conference. And because of that, I started getting a bit more API work. And again, it was kind of the snowball effect. It was in between all the other stuff I was doing. There's quite a lot of API stuff, but I think in general, the server-side community has moved towards doing a lot more API stuff, because with the increase of mobile apps and the increase of rich front-end applications, obviously there's less and less work being done by server-side developers to render forms and do all that shit. So APIs are becoming more and more popular, and as they did, I was like, right, I need to learn how these work, because I'm building crap ones, and I kind of listed down a whole bunch of the mistakes that I'd made in the past and how to avoid them. And people were like, oh, that sounds good. Can you expand on that? And I was like, all right, and did a book about it, and then got a job based off the book, and that sort of stuff. So it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies, just like everything else has been.
But I mean, you touched on a very interesting point there, though, like that, what you built in 2010, that REST server is what, still to this day, some people represent as REST.
Yeah.
They believe that is REST.
Nonsense.
And this is the common misconceptions of that. And just wondering, maybe you could go into kind of what you see as like the common misconceptions of REST, and what really is REST.
Great question.
Bit of a tough question. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Let me just crack this in 30 seconds. So basically, what a lot of people think of when it comes to REST is like pretty JSON URLs, right? They think they look at examples, and it's /users is the collection, and then /users123 is the resource, and that's about as far as you go. REST is about a lot more than CRUD, and also REST has nothing to do with HTTP and nothing to do with JSON. What's interesting is what a lot of people are calling a REST API is what I would have called like an AJAX endpoint 10 years ago.
Hitting it with jQuery and you began
exactly. Done. You just have like an AJAX controller, and it just returns shit, and it doesn't matter. You'd have no idea what it is. You just throw it in there, right? REST is an architectural concept, has no official set of tools, no specification, doesn't care about HTTP or AMQP. It can use any transport layer you want. And it's designed to decouple the API from the client. The focus is on making APIs last a really, really long time, right? So if you want an API that's going to live forever, then REST aims to help you with avoid problems that would make an API not last for a very long time, or like require a lot of change. So a lot of the time, interestingly, REST is used by people who are making an API that's probably going to only last 3 months because they're at a startup with 3 months worth of funding, right? So like the extra effort that people have to go to make a REST API be actually a REST API and not just some AJAX endpoints is actually sometimes potentially not worth it, because you're trying really hard to build a REST API just so you can say it's a REST API and have that like shiny thumbs up badge of honor that people seem to associate with REST. So it's an interesting one. There's something called the Richardson security model, which I mentioned, and it's a really interesting article. Martin Fowler has done an article about it, and there's 4 levels, starting with 0, obviously. And basically, they refer to level 0 as the swamp of POCs, and this is RPC, and it's a really unfair name because that makes it sound like RPC is bad. They're different things, but if you're using an RPC API to do what a REST API would be good at, then it's going to be a really bad one. So they think level 0, swamp of POCs, level 1's resources. So that's the idea of having like, trips or turtles or whatever resources and collections of resources, instead of just arbitrary methods like get all the turtles, get all trips, right? So then you have HTTP verbs on top of that, which help you give context to the request. So you can say,
That's typically where people end up, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's like, they stay there and they're like, yeah, this is REST for me.
They get there and they're done. And that's not quite the whole thing. That's like just a nice thing to do. It just makes sense, right? It lets you get and patch and put and delete and do all these different things with that resource. Because the idea is that the resource is a thing. It's like a URL is the ID, is its identification on the internet, and that's where it lives. And that thing can evolve over time, and it can have things added and maybe things taken away, and it can link to other things that also exist, and it's not just like an endpoint that you hit to get some data, because that's just a data exchange. That's not REST. And then hypermedia controls just means that, or HTOs as it's referred to sometimes, hypertext as the engine of application state. But yeah, so you get to that level and that's all about like linking to other stuff, right? The idea is that you can go to an API and you can browse it just around like anyone on the internet browses. So like I use the example in this article of like you research like how to do your tax returns and then end up on a BuzzFeed article about like the top 10 millionaires' wives just by clicking on links. And that's how hypermedia is meant to work. And if your API doesn't do that, it's not a REST API. That's not meant to be some well actually or being elitist and being like, wow, yours isn't good enough. It's just like the concept of REST is about this, dissertation of all these different things that you should do. And if you're not doing them, then it's not that. And so there's a lot of things that come into it, like cacheability. Not that everything has to be cached, but that everything should declare if it's cacheable. So you can build an API that uses cache control headers and say this is cacheable or this isn't cacheable, or this has an e tag of X, and if you request with an e tag of Y, then it will invalidate the cache. And you do all that stuff, and you can throw something like Varnish or Fastly in the way and intercept traffic, so that your API doesn't get mangled. And that's kind of part of the concept of REST. Now, REST doesn't talk about HTTP in that sense. It doesn't say anything about you should use Varnish. It just explains that you should utilize the uniform interface that you're in. So if you're doing it in HTTP, you should use HTTP and not like invent conventions on top, because
soap. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, SOAP is a whole pile of conventions, which is totally okay and kind of makes sense for some stuff. And I've changed my stance on SOAP. Like, it's annoying, but it's useful. Because like what people hate, I'm just rambling, so you can cut me off if you want. But
no, carry on, man. This is great.
Like with SOAP, what people really hate about SOAP is that you have the WSDLs and payload and envelopes, right? Like you have to say, not only do you say here's the data, but here's this other file that describes the data. Here's XML on top of XML. But what's hilarious about that is that people use that as a fault of REST. That it doesn't have that. Like people say one of the benefits of REST is that you can just have these, simple, pretty JSON URLs, which isn't the point. People are using everything wrong. But one of the reasons that people end up building these kind of REST-ish APIs is that you can just file get contents on a URL and it just JSON decode it, and then you've got the thing. But there's a whole bunch of other people that complain and say that that's not enough. Like the type strictness is too weak because JSON doesn't support all of the different types that you want. Like there's no real difference between a integer and a float in JSON, for example, sometimes. So people actually complain that JSON is too vague and falsely associate that with REST, and then build things on top of it. So we have JSON schema and we have JSON LD and we have all these other schema defining things, which are basically a WSDL. Right? So people sit around moaning about WSDLs and then recreate WSDLs in a different language. And so I'm not crapping on JSON schema or JSON LD at all. JSON schema is awesome. And I'm using it a lot coming up, but it's really funny that people crap on SOAP for the exact same thing that they are trying to recreate currently. And that's another thing that people say is amazing about GraphQL is that you can enforce types. I'm like, you can enforce types in REST as well. Just don't use JSON. Like if you want to use something like protobuf or bson, which is a bit more specific, then you can totally do that. And that has nothing to do with REST again. So if you want type strictness, don't use loose, fluffy JavaScript-like syntax for things,
No, that's it. I mean, REST, you can even use XML. Like it doesn't have to be.
Use XML, you can use images, you can use HTML tables, you can do whatever the hell you want in REST. It's just like a concept that allows different content, that allows different MIME types. Like if there's a MIME type for it, you can use it. If there's not, you can just do it anyway and hope people catch on to your convention. Like REST has nothing to do with JSON or anything else like that.
And I think, the hypermedia, and I think that was one thing last year when I started properly looking into this was, really kind of the fact that it's trying to tell a story and it's trying to abstract away kind of the hard-coded, say, links and things, and like trying to work out, from state-based stuff, saying like, I'm in this state now, so these are the things I can do with this, and I can flow to that, and I can go and do this and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. As opposed to, some like terrible APIs where you have to hit the login URL first, and then you make another request to some other endpoint, and then you have to log out afterwards.
Hard-coded.
If you don't, and you have to do them in the specific sequence, because if you don't, then the active sessions collection builds up and crashes the server, like all this weird shit. The rest is like, no, it should be stateless. You can do it in one request. It should be, using the conventions that everyone knows for the transport layer that it's in. It should be all those sort of rules. It should be easy to discover, so things can just run around and refer to each other and list their relationships, and instead of making everything be hard coded. And that comes with some pitfalls, right? Like if you have to make one request and wait for the response and then make another request, or make one extra request for each item in a collection, then obviously things get a little bit slow. And that is the downside to REST. I've heard some really good friends of mine, like they said, I'm a big fan of REST, but I don't like all that hypermedia stuff. I never use it. I'm like, well, come on. Like,
yeah, I know, that's the best part.
But like hypermedia isn't useful for everyone, right? So if your API is private and it's for a company that changes, like the last company we were at, we had a so-called REST API and we didn't use hypermedia at all. The clients couldn't care less. We put some links in there, which everyone just ignored because they knew what the links were. They were looking at the documentation. And so they were perfectly happy to hard code all the URLs because we were changing the code so quickly that we don't need this API to last forever. We don't need to be able to follow the different endpoints or whatever else. We just need this thing to work immediately. So waiting for extra requests, or we'd never, if we're calling a collection and each item had one other resource that it was linked to, we'd never do that directly. We were using JSON API, the specification with a really silly name. And we were just basically saying, okay, here's all the IDs, squish them all together, go and fetch all of those in one request, and then separating them out based off of that. So we weren't using hypermedia at all, just because we were optimizing for performance and reducing like HTTP handshake time and all that sort of stuff. So I totally get why people do it, but it's just this like misunderstanding of what REST is meant to be that causes a lot of confusion in conversations. And a lot of it sounds like, well, actually, and I'm never trying to do that. Like, I'm never trying to say, oh, you're an idiot because you don't know what this thing is. It's more like, it's just misleading when you see like really big, clever people saying, big public names saying like, oh, GraphQL is better than REST because of X. And you're like, actually, X has nothing to do with REST, and REST can do that as well if it wants to. And like all this misleading stuff, you end up with people that don't know quite as much necessarily, don't have quite as much experience or context, that listen to those kind of well-known names and then just go and make really bad decisions for their business and waste a bunch of time based off of that. And then, oh, my friend said that you should do this thing. And then like they're all doing the same mistake at the same time, and none of them have realized it yet, but it hasn't blown up in their face yet, so they recommend it to more people, and it's just a mess. So understanding what REST really is and then deciding whether that's what you need or not is I think fairly important.
No, absolutely. And I mean, like, actually trying to, read the dissertation is a good thing to do. Like, go and actually try and read it. It's
really, it's a lot. But they could really do with a marketing page as snazzy as GraphQL, right? Because that would do pretty well for them.
I think that may be the problem with REST, is that it's so, it is misleading. Like, what you get from people is kind of trickled down, like bits of it and stuff. And mainly people are just looking at level 2 and they don't ever go to level 3. And it's like, well, you need the publicity behind it to be like, no, look at this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, part of it is if you go and search for certain things, then you see a question asked on Stack Overflow, right? And it's, what's the RESTful way to do X arbitrary thing that has nothing to do with REST? And you'll see someone give an answer, which is, well, a good practice for HTTP APIs, if you're using JSON, is to blah. So they see the question, what's the RESTful way of doing it? And you're like, here's a good practice way for HTTP APIs in general. And they then, right, that's the RESTful way of doing it. And they'll link to the article for evidence. Then you're like, that's the RESTful way. That's the RESTful way. And so there's a big conflation between what's the RESTful way, what's a quick and like helpful way that might not be RESTful but is great, and here's the like just a general good practice and things like that. So it's REST, HTTP, and general good ideas are the 3 categories that a lot of stuff falls into, and people just call all of that REST, which is unfortunate and confusing.
I think that's what happens though, isn't it? When you get a buzzword that then becomes a thing that, people will try and put as much on it as possible and just, bring it up. It's like, no, that's part of REST too. No, that's part of REST. And everyone will just say, and because it sounds cool to say, I've got a RESTful, I've got a RESTful API.
Right. I mean, if you say like, if you were to ever say to somebody that doesn't quite know the differences between the lot, oh no, we're not trying to build a RESTful API, we're just building a HTTP API, or like they'd be like, what? Why aren't you using REST? You're an asshole. So yeah, you do kind of end up with people doing it just for the sake of doing it, and like striving really hard to be fully RESTful when they don't need to be, but also not understanding what is and isn't RESTful. So just wasting time doing stuff because someone said so on Stack Overflow, and it's weird.
I mean, you mentioned actually in a Smashing Magazine article you did last year, actually, the REST versus RPC, and saying, look, they both have their merits and use them for what they're both used. It's not replacing one with the other.
Yeah.
They both have a place.
Right, for sure. I think in the past I've like shat on SOAP and RPC a fair bit, and that was due to my own ignorance at the time. And I think the reason that a lot of people probably kind of crap on RPC is because, like I mentioned before, if you're using RPC style URLs and fetches and posts to do CRUD, which is what a lot of people are using REST for, then RPC is pretty bad at handling CRUD. You have like get foo, get list of foo, get all foos, get foo by this other thing, right? And you end up with these grotesquely verbose URLs instead of like the more pretty, supposedly REST style resources, right? So if you use RPC when really REST might have been a better fit, just like the kind of cruddy REST that everyone's used to, then RPC looks terrible. But if you're once you start building your REST API, if you have like a little bit of RPC stuff to put in, then people just kind of tuck that into a foo/123/ start or whatever. Like I put that in the example. They jam these like RPC style things in with their REST API, and they're like, that's okay. This all fits. It's REST. It's got those nice URLs.
It's just a fall on that. It's like, no, I'm using HTTP verbs as well, so it's great.
Yeah. So it's basically a case of, well, RPC is bad at handling CRUD, so RPC is bad, so we should use REST, and then we'll put some RPC in it, but we'll call it REST because it looks like RPC. We don't want to be RPC. So it's kind of a weird kind of situation like that, and I think I didn't really understand a lot of that for a long time, and so that was what the kind of RPC versus REST article was all about, and like talking about how Slack use it, where they're like, where would kicking somebody out of a channel fit in with a RESTful approach, or not even a RESTful approach? Like, where would kicking someone out of a channel fit in with the usual kind of collections and resources style that people normally use, right? You wouldn't necessarily have a collection to, you wouldn't be able to post to kicks. Like, that would be super weird. And there's all these different kind of confusing things that happen if you try and force something that's just a function being called into this like collections and resources and kind of approach. And REST isn't all about collections and resources necessarily, but usually is used in that way.
It's a big part of it, absolutely. And I think that, you mentioned there how to design, you're talking about like, the designing of these things, like how does it feel? And, does it feel like, the process and the story and stuff? And like you've actually mentioned in the past, like, API blueprint. I'm just wondering, like, these API design tools, how kind of frequently do you use them, like within API development? And, like, what's the process kind of, for your designing of APIs?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of tools around. There's API Blueprint, there's Swagger, there's Raml, and there's another one that I've totally forgotten that I don't care about. And
so, Runtan, do you think there's too many of them as well? Like, do you think that maybe there's like an explosion, such as like the formats we'll go into, but...
Maybe. There are 3 of them, and they've been 3 for a really long time. Like, none of these are new. Most of them have been around for a couple of years at least. Swagger is, I think, the oldest, but they're on like version 3, which is, the same as a new one coming out. So I don't think there's too many flown around, but it is tricky because they all have different tools. They all have totally different ecosystems, and they have totally different approaches. There is some work being done on kind of narrowing the gaps between Swagger and API Blueprint, because a lot of the Apiary is the company that is behind API Blueprint. They provide hosted services on top. Interesting, they were just bought by Oracle, so we'll see where that goes. But apparently everything's going to be fine. Whatever. Before they were hoovered up, they actually did a lot of work on supporting Swagger in their tools. So I think Dread, the like command line documentation testing tool, uses Swagger and API Blueprint, and like their website uses both. So some of the gaps are being eroded, but they all have quite different approaches, which I think is interesting. API Blueprint is basically a Markdown based language, which goes into an AST, and I think they might have added JSON format as well, but it's usually see it done in the Markdown version. Raml is basically YAML, which feels grotesque to document an API in YAML, but that's just me. And then Swagger is like this JSON schema subset, superset. Like we kind of use mostly JSON schema version 4, but added our own bits in there, and there's some other stuff too. So that they're a bit different from each other. And I've been using API Blueprint for the longest time. In my book, I kind of put right at the end, I was like, oh, and once you built the entire thing, you should probably write some documentation as well. Goodbye. And I think that was one of my biggest fuck ups of that book, which was I should have put it right at the start. I've actually started with a kind of documentation driven development approach to APIs, which I do think is the way to go. And these days, in the video series as well, I'm doing this where I start with the API schema first, because it means that you can just like list out a bunch of endpoints and list out a bunch of like you define the actual data, right? So with API Blueprint, you have data structures, and they refer to it as EMSON, which is just everything has to be BSON, EMSON, JSON. You basically just say, right, I'm going to have rabbits, and here are the properties of rabbits. Here are the fields, and you can say, whatever, and the field name is, and then the type, and then an example value, and a description. And you just do all of those, and you can reference other ones and say there will be, this. I don't know why I started with rabbits. It's going to be hard to do examples, but
I was thinking you do.
I don't know what I'm doing here. But yeah, like resource A can have all these properties and then an array of rabbits inside it, right? So you can refer to them and include them. And unfortunately, with API Blueprint, you end up with this one massive file because there's no like first party solution to like reference other files. And so that's why I'm starting to look at RAML as an alternative, because RAML will let you just document the. I kind of trode off the point I was about to make, but I'll look back. RAML looks at like a better alternative because you can list all the properties and everything with JSON schema, which is like a really generic, like loads of things understand JSON schema. You can build everything basically based off of JSON schema and then just reference those JSON schema files in your docs. And from there, you've got this really nice system where you can mock APIs. This is what I'm starting to say about API Blueprint and RAML. They all do the same sort of thing. Once you've got the specification built, you can mock APIs, you can send examples to your friends, you can build documentation. I've regularly in the past, I'll build out what I think the API endpoint should look like, and then you've got this like JSON thing, and you can use ngrok to share a URL, and the clients can like play with it. And if they get the right fields and it's in the right formats, then you agree on that specification. And once you've got that done, you say, right, we're agreed here. We're going to commit this specification, and then I'm just going to kind of build my code around matching that same specification. So you build the docs, you write the spec, which builds the docs, and then once it's agreed, you write the code. And as long as they match, the client has already built their stuff to work with that spec that you shared, right? Because they can actually use that mock to start building the iOS app front end. And then as soon as you're ready to go, you just switch over the URL and say, right, here's the real API, and ta-da, it's working, hopefully perfectly first time. So to surmise that ramble that crossed into a few other points, I use API specifications all the time, every day. I'm trying to push to get things used a bit more at WeWork, but I think I have to try this RAML plus JSON schema approach for it to take off, because the API Blueprint approach isn't going so well. But I use them to document an API before I build it, or before I build a new endpoint, get agreement, use the mock server to make sure that it's working nicely, and to give the people a way to start working before I finish coding. And then both the back end and the front end team can work in parallel, instead of one sitting around twiddling their thumbs for 2 weeks while the other person frantically rushes to try and get all the work done. So they're really helpful stuff.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I think, it's that seeing a real thing, isn't it? Being able to play with a real API and interact with it and see, oh, actually, this is a pain point, as opposed to, doing like 2 weeks dev time just to find out, actually, no, this isn't the direction we want to go in. Tweaking a couple of like YAML or whatever, kind of files is a lot easier, a lot better REPL loop.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to be just the idea of spending like 3 or 4 days writing something, and then someone goes, "Oh, actually, we don't need that," or that should be totally different. I'd murder someone.
From there, you've mentioned, you have touched on a little bit of JSON API, and I think this is another thing, where it's that kind of, there's a plethora of like API design tools, and there's also these loads of different formats, and like kind of formats that you can use to actually, transfer this stuff. And I'm just wondering, like, your experiences with some of them, like, with JSON API, how maybe, I'm just wondering, so how have you used them? And like in the, kind of like throughout the companies that you've worked with in your personal projects and stuff, like what have you found to be the best Which is a very hard question to answer, like best, worst, pros, cons of each. You know?
Yeah. You're asking the easy questions today. So,
I know, exactly.
So very honestly, I have never used collection JSON. I don't know what that thing does. But when it comes to the rest of them, I was really weird. Like in my book, it started off and I was like, here's the way that Facebook does it. Here's the way that Twitter does it. Here's the way that JSON API does it. But that sucks. And then like, here's this thing that I do, right? And it started off, I was like super cocky. I'm like, I'm not going to put data at the top. Why would I do that? And then I realized that you can't have metadata if you don't have like data in there and things like that. Or like it's hard to switch between a collection and an object. And I basically, over time, when I got to Ride 2 years ago, they used JSON API draft 1 or something. And I was like, oh God, here we go. Bloody JSON API, fine. And I was really sullen and sulky about it. And then over time, not only did the JSON API spec itself get better, like by the time they got to like draft 3, I think it was, I actually had far fewer problems with it. And it was actually really good. Like I really liked that draft. Hilariously, since then, they've done a few, between version draft 3 or draft 4, whichever it was that we had, and there was like 2 more drafts and then a final, I think. I'm probably getting these numbers wrong, but between the draft we used and the one that came out, they added a few things and changed a few things that I really liked, but they also changed a few things that kind of make it gross to work with. So JSON API is a lot of extra thinking. Like if you just want to look at your JSON, and you just want to get the data back, and that's about it, then JSON API is a lot of extra work. But I used to be a fan of the kind of the include approach to including like embedded relationships. So if you got if you were calling up resource A and then you say include B and then also include C, and B and C were both collections, then inside A would be, you know, all the B's, and then inside each B would be the C's, because it's embedding the relationships as you're going. And I used to really like that. And JSON API instead is like, well, you list the include A, B, and C, and we'll shove them all into this like related field, and you have to stitch them back together using the IDs mapping and stuff. And I was like, oh God, kill me, this sucks. But that's quite efficient for like handling repeated data, right? Like if you had a lot of those resources that were repeated, your response size could be drastically bigger than it needed to be. So there's a lot of these things that when you look at JSON API, you're like, this is dumb, I hate it. But you look into why those things happen, and it totally makes sense. So JSON API is really tough because I tell people you should use it. It's really good. It's really clever. Like a lot of smart people that really know their stuff did a really good job of working on this thing. And everyone, myself included at the time, was like, no, I don't need it. It's dumb. And then over time, you're like, oh, wait. That's
you realise you can't call him back, don't you? Thinking, actually, you've done a good job here. Sorry.
Yeah. But conversely, I think with How, I read a blog post about the person that invented it, and they were like, oh, I just wanted to make this thing and see if I could do like a HTTP spec. So I knocked this thing out in 5 minutes. And I'm like, that doesn't seem very mature or reasoned. And I'm sure there's been work on it since, but I feel like that was version 1 was just like one person typing some stuff into a markdown file. And I did appreciate the fact that JSON API had like a lot of people that I know, a lot of like really fucking smart people, like the HTTP people that I follow, they all had a lot of input on it, and it had a lot of pickup in the Rails community, which I think is probably why my Rails developer colleagues were pushing it. And everyone just agreed to use that. Like Ember Data had a JSON API adapter officially supported, I think, and like Rails supports JSON API, and like all these systems were just like, we are going to do this. And so it's one of those times where, like, you know, just with PSR2 in PHP, like it might not be perfect. It might not be how you'd do it if you had the chance. But the fact that we've all agreed to do it, just do it.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. It's what, you know, people have agreed on, you know, and that, yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just better having, you know, a baseline as opposed to just having, well, there's pros here, but there's cons there. And it's just like, no, do this one way, please.
And if you've got content types, you can do both, right? You can say, if you send me application/JSON, then I'll give you plain old JSON. But if you ask for application/VND plus JSON API plus JSON or whatever it is, then all right, cool. I'll send you the JSON API format. And if your serializer is smart enough to handle multiple formats, which it should, then that's totally fine. Most of the time, you just send it. I think with Rails Active Model Serializer, you just say, adapter equals JSON or adapter equals JSON API, and then it just does it. So that's easy.
That's nice. No, that's really nice. And like, so, kind of, you're now years of working in APIs, the theory, you've written a book on the theory, you've got the practice, actually in practical nature. I was wondering, like, kind of how your thinking has changed. I know you've mentioned, like, you kind of have thought about like soap in a different way now, and you're kind of looking at it in different ways, but also like, how it's changed for you, but also like the mistakes you see and you continue to see in other people's APIs maybe that you feel, that could be addressed.
Something that really frustrates me, and it seems like the most well actually point in the world, is when people return errors in a crap way. Errors are completely ignored. Status codes are terrible. People just put a string with the error message in there, so I have to do substring matching to work out what type of error happened. Or they'll only put a code in, so I have to go and look that up on some page, and I have no idea what it means. Like,
and it's definitely out of date, that documentation. So you are just screwed. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually had this. It was there was some YouTube error. It just said like parameter filter missing. So I tried doing filter equals this and filter equals that, and it wasn't that. And then I found out I was meant to put and mine equals true, and I found that out in some some website that was linked to from Stack Overflow, and the Stack Overflow thing was like, idiot, it's on their documentation, and there's a link to the documentation, and that documentation didn't exist anymore. I was like, God fucking damn it, I hate everything. Like, so annoyed. And so like errors that don't explain specifically exactly what the problem is need to go to hell. And the problem is that people think about errors as this like afterthought. They just throwing an exception that you never bothered to catch. They just like, who cares? And they don't realize that an API is all about doing stuff, and doing stuff can either work or it can not work. And I care way more about it not working than I care about it working, right? I don't assume things will work. I assume everything's going to go terribly.
The happy path.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just a happy path. It's like I want to test every single possible failure and make sure it's covered properly. I want to make sure that when I call an API, if I call a resource that doesn't exist, and it fails to find that item, that it doesn't explode with some like active record not found exception and give me a 500 message. Because if I get a 500, I'm going to call up your support line and be like, yo, your API is broken in production and this is fucked. And our company is having a bad time because we're getting 500s from you. And then they just go, oh yeah, we just didn't check to see if the result was null or not. Like, so those sort of things are really important. And again, with errors, if you return 200s on an error, there's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong. New Relic will assume that it's fine and it won't report that as an error, so we don't know. If you're using RunScope as a debugging proxy, which I've been doing quite a lot recently, again, that will be a perfectly successful thing. We had some third party that was super unstable, and I was trying to like make it work. Their API was not going well, and so I put RunScope debug proxy in it, channeling all the traffic through it, recording the requests, the responses, everything, in like perfect information and the exact number of milliseconds it took, all of that stuff. And I could see that they had about 20% error ratio. And not only was it a 20% error ratio, but it was higher than that. They had a 503 happening for a timeout, which is great. I want to see a 503 error for a timeout. That's perfect. But what they also had was other like, it just had an XML response saying API error 5. That's all it said.
Lovely.
That was a 200 message. So two fun things about that. The first fun thing is that RunScope had no idea. So that 20% failure rate was more like 50. And the other thing is that a 200 error will be cached. Varnish will cache that. So if you have a 200 response, if you have like this thing normally works, right? But then one time it fails, and then your code is being like, if I get a response and it's 200, then great. Not only will it like show really busted information on the client side the first time, but that's going to be cached for a really long time. So all of your other clients that request that same URL with the same context and scope and whatever else, any cache hit is going to have the error in the fucking cache. And most reasonable.
And everyone will get it really quickly because it's in the cache, which is great. You know?
So like when people say, oh, that's so stupid, it's not like, it's not some elitism like, oh, you should be trying to use as many of these different status codes as you can. Like, it's not like the Pokemon got to catch 'em all approach where you've got to have like, oh, I've got a 518, I've got a 571. Like, I'm just inventing numbers now, but you don't have to do that, but you do need to at least get the right category of error. You want to have like a 4 something or a 5 something, depending on whether you fucked up or they fucked up. And then within that, you want to use as close as you can to the most appropriate, because people have the whole wonderful thing about REST and the fact that it uses HTTP is that there's loads of really sane expectations you can set around the ways that HTTP works. So like if you're using a REST API and you're returning a 403 error, everyone knows that means forbidden and that you should try again. And instead of 401, which is unauthorized, which means you need to log in. So I, as a developer or an application that I make, can know that 401 means that you need to try logging in, and 403 means we know that you're trying to log in, but your information's wrong. And my code can act differently accordingly, right? Either try and log them in again or like send them an error being like, yo, your tokens don't work. But it's really important that those things are different. And even things like what was it? Someone was returning Google API returns a 403 when they mean you've gone over your rate limit. And because 403 to most APIs just means like you're not logged in. A lot of the time, there was this one system I think called Hello.js, and it was like an OmniAuth kind of a OAuth provider login based system. So this system was noticing a 403 come back. So it was like, oh, the tokens must be invalid. I'll try refreshing. And so it was hitting them and using up the rate limit, which was then making it 403 even more. So even more people were getting it. So even more people were spamming it. And it was just a fucking botnet of rate limiting. And that's because they were expecting like 422 to be the, hey, calm down, chill out for a minute. And instead it was 403, try harder. So Google kind of screwed us there because they didn't want to use 422 because it's not official or whatever else, right? So like these expectations are not just some nerd saying, well, actually, they are like expectations that the internet works in a certain way. And if you start fucking with those conventions, then you have knock-on effects that you can't possibly imagine. Like I couldn't have known about any of that stuff until someone told me about it, and I'm laughing my ass off. One more actually. If you do destructive actions on Get, then there was this one chap that worked for Rackspace, and he said they had some delete stuff happening on a Get, and because they were using hypermedia, they had this one lovely XML page for their collection, and all of the delete actions were linked to. So Google got onto their API, started crawling through it and deleting their content. They're running around in circles wondering if they've been hacked, if there's anything going on. Like, where's all this deletion coming from? Why are our databases empty? And it's just Google doing its job, right? So like these conventions exist for a damn good reason, and you should try and use them and not just go when someone says that it's a good idea.
Absolutely amazing. I think I mean, speaking about like these errors and stuff, like do you have there's also format types for handling transfer of this data. Like is there format types like standards for error handling, like for returning errors?
Yeah, totally. There's one. There are two very prominent ones that I would recommend that you look at. I won't recommend which one you use. It's up to you. JSON API, whether you like the standard itself or not, you can ignore the entire rest of the spec if you want. If you just look at their errors section, it's really good. They have ID so that you can specify a specific instance of it, and maybe even like track you can have error codes and everything else. So the ID could be a Redis list of this specific user called this specific page and had this specific instance. So when someone gives you that ID, you know exactly what happened. And that can, in the background, can link to a trace ID so that you know all the different systems it touched, right? You can have message for the human. You can even have title so that you have a short message that you can display in your interface. And then the longer message can be hidden behind some show more information with a submit ticket to support, which when you click it is already populated with like a title, or it goes to the right department, or it has an ID in there. Like the JSON API makes you think about all the different types of information that you should put into an error, and you can start with very minimal and kind of add more things as you go. But it's a really good place to look. The one that I've never used but is definitely very good is one called HTTP Problems, and it's written by Mark Nottingham, who has done a lot of HTTP stuff. Like he's one of the main dudes of the internet. and he's right up there. Roy Fielding, there you go. So Roy Fielding and Mark Nottingham have worked together on a lot of different RFCs and things for HTTP. And this is another one. And so it's very complicated. There's a lot of stuff in there. It might not look very pretty, but the HTTP problem RFC is a very good one to look at least to make you, even if it just makes you think about some of the stuff that you should be putting into your errors.
As you say, people take errors as they're second class citizen. They want to look at the happy path. And with an API, you can't think like that because you don't know how the person's going to use the system. You really don't, unless it's a controlled API, but you still, you need to give the people the information. They're not going to get a bug trace from it. They probably don't want to see a stack trace from it. They want to see, who can I contact, to fix this issue, as opposed to how do I fix it myself?
Think about it this way. If you build an API that has a bunch of errors that happen and no one knows where the documentation is, or you haven't bothered writing the documentation, or the errors don't link to the appropriate section in the docs, then you're going to have a lot of emails and a lot of people hitting you up on Slack and a lot of people talking to you. And that is annoying. I hate people. No, but if you build it really well and you build your errors so that they're self-documenting, but if you really, really, really need more information, or you want to link to like a proper like guide section to help you through the problem, or like a section in the FAQ, then you can do that. You put all that stuff into your documentation, you put it into your errors, you link the two together, and then when things go wrong, people know exactly what to do and they leave you the hell alone.
That's it.
If it's a big, massive API, then usually these things are on Stack Overflow. But if it's your API that you're just releasing, then it's not going to be there. So you have to make sure that the API is self-documenting for humans and for computers, not just one, not just the other. And then everything's better. You get more time to just go to the pub.
That's it. Make your life easier. Yeah. This will make your life easier. Oh, thanks so much, Phil, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, not a problem.
I won't keep you for too long, but one last question. You've transferred over to Ruby, and I'll be really intrigued, to kind of what parts of PHP do you miss, and vice versa with Ruby, what parts, of Ruby would you like to see in PHP?
What I miss about PHP, I really miss being part of the community, I guess. I mean, I always get into silly arguments on Twitter with the PHP lot and kind of was mostly joking around a lot of the time, but I do miss a fair few of them. Like I said, because Ruby has their stuff together a bit more, like I've not really needed to get involved, which means that I'm just like quietly using it and getting on with my day. Like I occasionally send a pull request, I occasionally write a blog post, but I don't really do anything. And it's nice, obviously, to be in, like, this known name and to be part of this thing and to like be friends with all the top people and whatever. But I miss that a little bit. But at the same time, like it's much more rewarding to not have to bother. So so like I'm spending a lot more time like cycling and racing and getting fitter and faster and falling over a bit less, and that's fun. So it's a different change, but. With the Ruby stuff, what I really like is there's a lot of the syntax. Like Ruby seems to basically have a dedication to making the language as simple for developers to do things as they can, right? There's a lot of syntactic sugar. Some would say too much syntactic sugar, perhaps, but they are trying to save you keystrokes. They're trying to save you as much time and effort as they possibly can. And there's definitely a lot of quirks and gotchas. Like the people that made PHP sadness need to do a Ruby sadness. There's some madness in there. Like Ruby is super weird, and people don't give Ruby enough shit, to be fair. But I really like the simplicity of the syntax, the way that they have everything's an object. Like that's part of what makes Ruby pretty damn slow in comparison to PHP. Like PHP is faster in general. If you have the stock installations and whatever, you can use Java, Ruby, and all that stuff to make it quicker. But like the number of things that Ruby has to do per thing that you write as a developer is higher, so they can optimize that away. But there's still more things happening by default, right? Because everything's an object and everything's got a million parents. There's even like a true class and a false class and a nil class, right? Everything's a class. And so what's cool about that is that you don't have this weird separation that PHP has between like an array and an object that has all of the same properties as an array. That's one thing that I always find pretty weird. But the other cool thing is that a lot of the frameworks like Laravel are trying to have these like more functional programming, and like you have map and filter and reduce and all these things that are kind of userland code that they're all built into a lot of them are built into Ruby itself, and some of them are kind of squished in there by Rails. And there's some really cool stuff in there. You can just like call up a thing and then do .map to change the shape of the data, because you don't want all of it, you just want a certain part. And then you can do like .reject, which will kick out anything from that map that's not matching that's not true. And you do all these things, and there's much. I haven't written a for each in Ruby ever, right? You don't have to do that stuff. You don't have to like loop, declare an empty array and then for each through it and then push things in, and then you have these 2 arrays now, and make sure you don't reference the first one because it's the old one. Like, you just have array dot and then map or filter or reduce, and that's it. So that's a really nice thing. And there's a bunch of stuff. I actually did an article for SitePoint, I think. People who just recently have been saying, like, do you want to do this random article about this random thing? And I'm like, yeah, I've got credit cards to pay off. SitePoint, Rails. Yeah, I did an article, and I'll send you a link for the show notes, which basically says, like, here are the differences, like philosophical and like specific. They're both great. They're just a bit different. One of the things that's the most screwed up is the fact that in PHP, the difference between a property, a method, and a local variable is very obvious, right? But in Ruby, it's the same. You don't have that much syntax. You just have a bare word. You just have the word like fudge. And that could be a local variable, a global variable, a property in this class, maybe a property in the parent, like a method in the local class, a method in the parent. Like, there's much less difference between methods and properties and variables and things. There's just like words, and that's really cool when you know about it, and you can use that to build these really flexible kind of APIs and Ruby APIs, like SDKs. You can build these really pretty ways of doing things, but it's also super weird when you don't know about it.
I can imagine a learning curve there for sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you have I had a global, in Rails, there's a global session, global variable called session, which contains all of the session stuff. And I was trying to access that in a user's controller, which had a sessions method. And inside the sessions method, it's just, if you call sessions, it no longer points to the global variable, it points to itself. So you call it and it's empty because that doesn't return anything. I'm like, what the fuck? Man. That's so annoying. And then, of course, the reaction from everybody is, well, that's just not how you do it. I'm like, right, no, I get that. And now I know I'll never do it again. But God damn it, that's annoying. Like in PHP,
exactly, the initial, the kind of learning curve to get there.
Yeah. Like PHP has way more syntax, and you have to do like arrows and brackets and all these different things and this, and there's a dollar at the start of everything, and sessions is $_ capital letters session for no apparent reason, and those things are annoying, but they're also helpful because the extra typing means that things are more specific. But in Ruby, it's like, we don't care about being specific. There's some weird shit you got to learn, and once you've learned it, you can just knock stuff out really fast. And as long as everyone knows how everything works, it's fine. But if you don't know, then fuck you, I guess. You should learn. So it's kind of helping the developer out, but as long as you're happy playing with their rules. Whereas PHP is like, we don't like sugar, shut up. You have to type a lot, but at least you know what's going on. Which is two different ways of looking at the same sort of thing,
No, that's really, really cool, man. And you say, like, thank you for coming on. And the last thing actually is, so obviously, you've moved away from PHP Town Hall, and you are, you discussed on there actually your last episode, the API busters.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, have you got an ETA on like the first episode drop in, or have you recorded it yet?
No, we were going to do it this month, but I'm doing it with another WeWorker. And we were both away. I think I was telling you about this before we came on. We were both away at the WeWork summit over in Los Angeles, and they basically paid for the entire company to go over and get drunk for a couple of days. So we were
absolutely awesome.
We were both there like, we should totally start recording this thing, and then we just didn't bother. But I think within the next 2 weeks, there'll be a first recording, and we're not entirely sure on the format yet, but we both work in APIs a lot. We both do platformy stuff, and we just want to talk about that. So part of it will be some super nerdy things like comparing different API specifications, and some of it's just going to be like, here's the shit that happened at WeWork this week, and let's all laugh about how badly that went. Obviously we have to be careful about not releasing anything that makes the company sound shitty, but like engineering choices that were questionable or that had problems or that we fixed or whatever will probably be the sort of stuff we're talking about.
No, I think that's great. I think like the theory and the practical, and actually use cases, because I think you value, in both of those.
Yeah.
Brilliant, man. Well, yeah, say thank you so much again, Phil, for coming on the show, and I'll let you have the rest of your evening to do what you want with.
Yeah. Cheers, Ed. Thanks very much.
All right, man. Well, yeah, as audience, it's been another great episode, and we'll speak to you again next week. Goodbye.
You've been listening to 3 Devs and a Maybe. You can contact us at contact@3devsandamaybe.com or follow us on Twitter at 3 Devs and a Maybe.